So you tried for the first year, it sounds like, to protect your job. You thought you could. You thought you could do both. Where, at what point did you realize that there was a significant possibility that you could lose your job at Levi's? And how did you decide to keep going, saying these things, knowing that risk?
Yeah. So, I started on social media in March of 2020. No one said anything to me at work until September of 2020. So there was just silence during that time. I mean, I was getting some vilification online. And to be clear, I was also attending school board meetings, and I started to lead rallies by the fall, and I wrote a few op-eds, started to appear on the local news in December of 2020. But no one called me or reached out at all to say, hey, cut it out. So I was like, maybe they don't notice or maybe they don't care. But I did get a call in September 2020, encouraging me to stop. And then I got a call from someone different every 2 weeks, legal, HR, whoever, a board member, you need to stop when you speak on behalf of the company. And I would kindly say, I don't, I'm just a mom. Yes, I have this title, but I'm not using it. I'm just a, mom of 4 public school children. And I felt like at that point I had a little bit of a leg to stand on because, like I said, they'd all sent their kids back to in-person school. By the spring of 21, by January, we became, my husband and I, very clear that the schools were not going to open in the spring, that it was going to go beyond a year. And so we decided to move, at least temporarily, so that our younger children could attend in-person school, because my son, who was 6 at the time, was struggling with it. We wanted him to have some kindergarten, so that his first year of school was not, staring at a screen like this. So we moved to Denver. I tweeted about it. That got some attention. And I ended up being invited to go on the Ingram angle, Laura Ingram. I agreed to do that. I am proud of everything I said. I'd do it again. I'd say it to her. She and I may disagree on some other things politically, but she was really ahead of the curve on this. I think she was the first national pundit to talk about it. And why do I have to agree with someone on everything just because, if I talk to them? So the backlash to that was very severe internally. And that's when serious email campaigns started. That's when I was told I needed to do an apology tour. That was the moment in time that I was like, okay, I might not keep my job. Why I decided to keep going, because it was sort of said to me at this point by my boss, the CEO, if you stop, maybe you could be CEO. At this point in my mind, I was like, there's no chance. Even if I stop, there's a year of tweets and op-eds and news appearances. If they want to get rid of me, they're going to get rid of me. I'm in for a dime, I'm in for a dollar at this point, because the only way this changes at this point, and I come off in a good spot, is if the culture changes and we come to some sort of realization that this was wrong. Then suddenly I'm okay. But if I stop my advocacy at this point, it won't save my job if the culture doesn't change. That's why.
You kind of have this Cassandra effect going on where you're just too early to the party on everything that you're calling. Were in that position with gymnastics. You were in that position with school closures. I want to talk a little bit about the gymnastics thing too, because again, this was you were in a position that I've heard you describe multiple times as being a position you're not terribly comfortable in, being the person who's dissenting and going against the grain and standing out and speaking out. And yet you did with gymnastics too. And I feel like that probably helped prime you to some extent to feel braver in
Definitely.
this position in COVID. Can you talk a little bit about the gymnastics
Sure.
advocacy and what made you want to stand up in the first place there too? Because that's also a difficult position to put yourself in.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I had been a gymnast from the time I was 6 until about 19. And the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years of my gymnastic career was a really brutal training environment. That was the gym that got me to a national championship win. But it's hard to explain to people who have normal childhoods how brutally just cruel this culture was. Physical abuse. I trained on a broken ankle for 2 years, near starvation diet, fat shamed, the physical abuse in the traditional sense, slapping and hitting, that had stopped in the 70s. It did happen in the 70s. But, I was an 80s gymnast, but, we trained 8 to 10 hours a day, ate less than 400 calories a day, if that. Like I said, trained on broken bones, humiliated constantly, told we were garbage. And of course, there is sexual abuse in the sport, which has been exposed. So I was not sexually abused, but I was around it. Like, we knew the coaches were. The national team coach, who I traveled all around the world with, was a known sexual abuser. No one said anything. He was very well respected as a coach, so you knew not to say anything. You knew you wouldn't be listened to. So 20 years later, I'm in my late 30s, about to turn 40. I have 2 children. I'm pretty successful, and I'm still sort of suffering the repercussions of that kind of abusive culture. I mean, I'm good, right? Like, I'm married, I got 2 kids, I have a career, but sort of self-esteem issues, anxiety issues, coming out of the sport, it was really bad. Like, PTSD symptoms, eating disorder got much, much worse, anorexic, and then bulimia. And it was just really hard to find my footing. Like, if you're told you're a piece of garbage for most of your childhood, you sort of believe it. You just do. And it's really hard, even if you know better, to overcome that. And so when I sat down to write the book, I was certainly doing much better than I was in my early 20s, but I was still struggling. And so it really was just me trying to make sense of it. That's it. I didn't think I would get it published. I wasn't a writer. I was a marketer at Levi's at the time. I was a successful gymnast, but not a famous one. It's not like I was Mary Lou Retton or Dominique Moceanu or some of these gold medal winning gymnasts. Didn't have a ghostwriter. I just sat down to write it to make sense of it for myself. And while I knew it would be controversial, I didn't really think it would be as controversial as it was, because I thought we all knew. We all talked about it, But I ended up getting it published, much to my surprise. And it ended up being very controversial and provocative. It came out in April of 2008, right before the Olympics. And the U.S. Olympic Committee and USA Gymnastics and the machinery just went in place to smear me as just a loser who didn't know anything and was now just grifting, trying to make money, which I didn't need to do. I had a successful career. I don't think people know how little money you make writing books, unless you're like Michelle Obama or something. It's not you have to do it because you have something you want to say. It is not a money-making proposition. And so you have to also remember that was early days of social media. So I didn't know about trolling. I didn't know about any of this. I signed up for Facebook just because my book was coming out. I'd never been on social media. So the cruelty, and the just absolute horrific name calling was a shock to me. And I didn't really know how to manage it. Now I know, you mute the responses, you don't look. But it wasn't just social media. I mean, I'd be on the radio and people would call in and threaten to sue me, people that I knew, that I had trained with. So Wow. It was like real life too. It wasn't just social media. I mean, this woman who I am now good friends with again, when I did a national radio appearance on NPR, she called in at the end and said, basically everything I was saying was slanderous, libelous about these coaches. And I was just in it for a buck. And I knew who it was as soon as I heard the voice. I said, "Hi, Jessica. I'm sorry you have a different takeaway from the experience, but this is what happened." And it's interesting. About 3 years later, she called me on the phone and she said, "You were right about everything." I couldn't face it. She had been sexually abused by one of our coaches. She had been ignored when she brought it to other adults. And she just hadn't, she built a wall, We're friends now. But it was, my point is it wasn't just social media. It was kind of real life too. And no one else spoke out about it. But I think, again, I didn't go in trying to start a fight or be provocative. I was just trying to make sense of my own experience and my own story. And in the early days when I was interviewed on the morning shows and TV and stuff, I would say, I would try out of self-protection to say, this isn't an indictment of the sport. This is just my story. I was trying to, and then I eventually became emboldened over time. And I was like, yeah, this sport is rotten to the core. It is an indictment of the sport. Far too many kids are abused as a matter of course. But in the beginning, I was in self-protection mode.
Well, it's really painful to be like one of the first people to see something for what it is and to speak out about it. Because it's also to your friend's what she said when she called in and the fact that she wasn't willing to face it. I think that's pretty common too, that when you start attacking something or even just questioning something, that's a very core integral piece of someone's life or even society at large, like the school system. It feels like a personal attack to a lot of people, or it brings into question things that they're not willing or ready to face. And so it gets very difficult to have conversations about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think for a lot of us who grew up in the sport, it was really damaging. And we also had really good things happen. You know, I'm very proud of the fact that I won a national championship. And so you can choose to just remember that and try to put the other stuff aside, but it kept coming back for me, you know, in like nightmares and all sorts of other ways, you know, continued body dysmorphia, although that dissipated by my 30s, but that's a long time. That's 10 years after I was out of the sport. And just a general feeling of like never being good enough, you know, just real like imposter syndrome and all of just always feeling like everything was my fault. Relationships, if they didn't work, were my fault. I mean, I would like at work, if something went wrong, you know, it had nothing to do with me. I would say, oh, I'll take responsibility. Like that's how it was crazy. So it just was like affecting my life. And for me, writing it down was the way, you know, to deal with that. It wasn't an especially brave or courageous act, but I did have to gather my courage as I was attacked. And I became stronger and more courageous, you know. And then I think with the Nassar story breaking, which is such a horrific, colossal illustrative example of what was happening in the sport, that's when I sort of came to this realization that the truth does out in the end. And if you see it first and you say it, people will come and join you over time. You just have to steel yourself against the backlash in the meantime.